In a hydraulic system, the reservoir, also known as the tank, is the container for the hydraulic fluid, from which the fluid is pumped out to the system and back to which it returns. But it has a lot of other functions too. A primary function is as a heat exchanger. So this is a big sheet metal box with lots of wall surface, and when the oil goes out through the cylinders and motors and does its work, there's a lot of friction, and that generates a lot of heat, so the oil gets hot. And when it comes back to the tank, those walls of the tank allow the heat to dissipate out into the air. If there is entrained air, the reservoir lets those air bubbles settle out. And if the system has picked up dirt in the oil, this tank lets the dirt settle out. You will recall from when we looked at drawing schematics that in order to keep our schematic drawing clean, we draw a tank symbol every place a line is going to return back to tank. So even though we have many lines all going back to tank, at the end of each one we put the tank symbol, and that keeps the drawing clean. Back to the physical tank. So inside the tank is a baffle, and a baffle is a big wall made out of metal, and the oil can get up over the top of the wall. The wall is not as high as the oil, but it has to take a circuitous path. So the oil comes in the inlet port that's coming back from the system, and back here behind the baffle there's some turbulence and blah blah blah, and eventually the oil gets up over the baffle and comes back down the other side. Well, this quiet zone allows the oil to dwell, and it lets the contaminants settle out into the bottom. And it also lets those air bubbles settle out, so that by the time it comes back over here to the outlet going back to the system, everything's all clean and unbubbly. And that baffle also is good for dissipating heat. First of all, when the oil comes in here, that baffle prevents that hot oil from making a straight line over to the intake line. So it has to dwell in here, spend some time, give up its heat, and by the time it gets over to the pump inlet, it has cooled down some. That oil may well have picked up little tiny metal particles from the system as it was going through, and so in the bottom of the tank there's a low point where you can take out a drain plug and drain out the oil for maintenance. But that drain plug has a magnet in it, so when the oil comes back from the system, it settles around that drain plug, and that magnet attracts the metal particles and keeps them from going back into the system again. The bottom of the tank is slightly sloped, and then in the tank, in addition to a drain plug where you drain out the oil, there's also an access cover. Maintenance will be required at some point, and so you take off this, you drain the oil, you take off the cover, you reach in, you clean out the tank, you put in fresh oil. They try to keep the oil level high enough so that it doesn't get down close to the inlet strainer and cause one of those spinning whirlpools in the oil, a vortex. So you can see the oil level here is up above the baffle and several times higher than the suction strainer. The oil, of course, operates the cylinders and hydraulic motors, the various actuators. It does other things too. Of course, it carries away the heat, and it provides seals in these various places, and it lubricates these moving parts. There are different kinds of hydraulic fluid, hydraulic oil, and one of the ways we describe them is with the viscosity rating. And we won't go into all the different ways, Centipoise, Stokes, and kinematic viscosity, blah, blah, blah. There are different ways of scoring this, but what we want to remember is what viscosity means. And it doesn't mean that the oil is slippery. High viscosity is actually stickiness. And here's a way to remember that. Viscum is a Latin word for a substance called bird lime. And bird lime is so called because it was this white, sticky substance that mistletoe emits. And the Romans would eat small birds, and so they would get sticks and dip them in this bird lime, and now the sticks were sticky and they'd use them to catch small birds, which they would then kill and eat. Now, that is kind of a horrifying image to some of us, and I'm sorry about that. Nevertheless, it is a memory trick. It's a way to remember that viscous means sticky.